Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Morganroth with the South Florida Tribune, and we begin our inaugural South Florida Tribune podcast. And I'm happy to be joined by my partner, Jeffrey Edelman. And Jeffrey, glad to have you as my partner.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to the Edelman Law Studios.
Great to be here. You know what? I don't care where we do this out of, as far as I'm concerned. It's always a pleasure, and this is an opportunity for us to begin a new era with the South Florida Tribune. Not only are we an online publication, but now we're getting into the podcasting business, and I can assure you we'll have the best guests that we possibly can, and we couldn't lead it off with anybody better than Frank Lodato, a guy for whom I've known for 10 years, dating back to when the Florida Atlantic University Owls played at Lockhart Stadium. Frank, glad that you're with me on my latest endeavor.
Thanks very much for having me, Scott.
You're very welcome. So, anyways, we have a very busy show ahead of us, so let's get right to it.
Well, before we go any further, I think that Frank needs a little bit more of an introduction for his accomplishments throughout his career. For those of you who are not familiar with Frank Lodato, he is a sports psychologist, but he started doing this in 1958 in the college game and has been involved with NFL teams, NHL teams, and recently with the Canadian Football League. So the perspectives that Frank Lodato has in sports are unique to what most of you probably heard in other interviews, because he gets into the psyche, into the mental state, and how to get these athletes to perform at the highest level that they can. And Frank, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Well, can you give the audience the benefit of how things started? How did you get into this business?
Well, I earned my PhD from St. John's University in 1955, and the general attitude was among students and among faculty is that psychology could solve, at that time, every problem in the world. I was always interested in sports, and I knew there was something in the connection between psychology and sports performance, but I didn't know what it was. So I started looking around and trying to find some help. I couldn't get any. So I began experimenting. I was teaching a course to athletes at Manhattan College, and I had a class full of basketball players and trackmen, and part of their assignment was to be participants in my experiments with this thing. And I owe the beginning to particularly the basketball players at Manhattan College for many, many years, because they were my subjects and they got me started. I realized that you couldn't just call a sports team and say, I can do this. You had to have some credentials. So that meant instead of trying to contact sports teams, it meant trying to get some credentials in terms of scholastic publications. And that's what I focused on for a while. In addition to that, I took every kind of workshop available trying to learn graded techniques. By the time I finished that, I was arms for bear, but very few people were interested. And finally, I did get a couple of breakthroughs, particularly when I was living in Florida at the time. I was working at Biscayne College, which is now St. Thomas College, and Shula had the training camp at Biscayne College, and I got to know a lot of the Dolphin players like Tim Foley and Larry Little and all of the players at that time. And we played around with it. We played with a little experimentation, and they were all interested, and they motivated me to go further. When Bill Arnsparger was named head coach of the New York Giants, he brought me with him, and that's where it really began full time.
Wow. And, you know, from where it started in 1958 to where it is now, where there was not a study of sports psychology back then, but now how many programs are there throughout the country for sports psychology?
There are at least 50 graduate programs in sports psychology, and if you counted United States and Canada, they're probably close to 60.
Wow.
Canada had done a lot of work somewhat prior to what we had done in this country. Sports psychology dated back to about the late 1930s. With a man by the name of Coleman Griffiths from the University of Illinois. He was considered for many years to be the father of American sports psychology. Newt Rockne got him interested in the performance aspect of psychology, and there are a lot of letters that were sent from one to the other trying to discuss how psychology could help Rockne win football games.
Wow. Well, again, the amount of decades that you have in sports, it's incomparable to really so many. But, let me ask you this. Can you name some of the other teams that you've worked with over the years? You mentioned the New York Giants.
I worked with the Giants, the Philadelphia Eagles. I worked with 3 teams in the Canadian Football League starting in 1983. And the Montreal, they were called Concords at the time. They're the Alouettes now. Calgary Stampeders and the BC Lions. I have 3 rings, Grey Cup rings from the Calgary Stampeders and 2 from the BC Lions. I worked in the NBA with the Orlando Magic, and I worked in hockey with many, many franchises. I worked with the Bruins for 10 years. I worked for 4 years with the Florida Panthers. I worked for the LA Kings for 13 years and the Devils for 7 years, and did some consulting with other teams on both the minor league and NHL level.
Okay, Frank, from a cumulative standpoint, how many championship rings do you own? Do you have a very big jewelry box?
I have a safe deposit box. I have 12 rings. I actually was involved in about 20 championships. I didn't get rings for all of them. For example, we won the Ivy League championship when I was working with the Yale hockey team, and we were given a Tiffany charm for the bracelet. The coach was superstitious. He didn't want to have a ring until he won the national championship.
Oh, so you've got more rings. You have as many rings as Yogi Berra and is it Phil Jackson? My goodness, Frank, you're really moving up, brother.
Well, Yogi Berra may have more, but
I don't know.
But he's making a run for it.
Yeah,
for sure.
Well, between Phil Jackson and Yogi Berra. But Frank's got 12, so he's got the dirty dozen. Good stuff. Yes. So in your own words, Frank, what is sports psychology?
Well, it's a lot of things, but basically it's trying to get people to focus better, to concentrate better, to perform better. And that requires a lot of different skills, because some of the reasons psychological people don't perform well. Some of them are more simple, they're kind of mechanical things. The research shows, and I haven't seen it recently, but about 80% of people who are involved in sports psychology show improvement in their performance.
Very interesting. Okay.
Particularly through visualization of the completion of the perfect task.
And that's something that you specialized in?
Yes, I did.
So started out, what brought you in to do it?
Interest in sports and curiosity between what psychology was able to contribute to sports performance.
Okay.
When you say visualization, what do you mean?
Well, I did a study with hockey players, and I found that visualization became much more valuable if you started out with a relaxation technique, so that the player is relaxed, and once he's relaxed or she's relaxed, they begin to visualize perfect execution of a particular skill, and going over that over again and again. The research shows that the synaptic reactions are improved as much by visualization as they are by actual practice. That doesn't mean practice isn't important, but it assists practice and performance enhancement.
Wow. Well, yeah, again, we hear that term thrown around, and I appreciate you explaining that to the audience. Let me ask you this. We all hear it, and we're all sports fans, but we hear people say, oh, those $1 million athletes, they make $100 million. What do they have to worry about? Just go out there and play. Can you kind of explain to somebody who has that mindset why it's not as simple as flicking a switch to go and play? That, how do you deal, that these athletes, just because they're making a lot of money doesn't mean that they turn off their emotions.
No, and fans don't realize how difficult it is to succeed at a high level. I have learned a tremendous respect for athletes and what they do, particularly hockey players. It's so taxing on the body, and what they do day after day is unbelievable. The suffering and pain they go through for that. Now, I know they get paid a lot of money and all of that, but that's only part of it. The fact is you have to have a lot of courage in order to stay with it. Look at the Bruins in the playoffs this year. The entire front line was aching. Chara played with a broken jaw.
Goodness.
Yeah, Bergeron played in the past with with broken ribs and ended up puncturing his lung. Gregory Campbell stayed on the ice to complete a shift with a fractured knee. There's a tremendous amount of respect I have for these men. I think they're crazy, but I think they're courageous.
I agree with everything you said, including that they're crazy.
Yeah, hockey players are definitely a different breed for another day. But so, Frank, were you talking to the entire team or individually to players or both?
A lot of it depended on the coaches. Some coaches just ignored me. Some had me speak to the team and wanted feedback, and it worked well. But some coaches are very threatened by psychologists because they feel as though management is saying, you're not good enough to do this job on your own.
Yeah, I can appreciate.
Just kill it.
Yeah.
Yeah, coaches are an interesting breed without a doubt, Frank. I've dealt with a lot of them in the journalism field too. So I guess it sounds like to me everyone reacts differently. Sometimes they probably welcome you, and then sometimes, let me take. This is what I'm paid for. You find many times that's a reaction that you get out there.
Oh yeah, and coaches feel threatened because some coaches feel that they're both mother, father, and sister and brother, and everything that's possible to be for their players. They don't like any interference.
When you say with coaches, you've worked with college teams and pro teams, right?
Yes.
Do you find that it's different dealing with in your experience, are the college coaches more receptive, the pro coaches more receptive, or it doesn't really matter?
Well, I think, in my experience, I think the college coaches were a little bit more receptive. But generally, the same kind of dynamics existed. Some college coaches had you there, but they didn't want you to do anything and things like that. But
right.
I worked for Laval University in Quebec, and we won the Vanier Cup that year. That coach was very, very receptive, and he included me in everything. I knew what was going on a daily basis. That makes it a lot easier to work.
Now, Frank, I'm sure you've heard this all the time, but those whiny players that are paid millions of dollars and don't complain, why don't you elaborate on what the conception is over there?
Well, I have grave concerns about where sports is going in this country and all over the world, as a matter of fact. Look at the amount of money premier soccer players make in Europe or in other places of the world. I think money might be one of the things that's going to dull and kill sports. I think once the players begin to make much money, some of them, I read someplace, and I think it was tongue-in-cheek, that some players make more in a year than the corporate executive they're being paid by.
That's saying something right there.
Yeah. Sure is.
Well, I read that